begin the plenary session. We are very lucky and greatly honored to have 5 distinguished keynote speakers here today. Their speeches will be followed by a plenary discussion with President FEULNER, Chairman CAMPBELL, and Professor Jie-ae. So we welcome submission of questions from the audience in written form. We specially invited Professor Jie-ae of Ewha Women's University as the MC and the moderator for this session. Please welcome Professor Son.
Even though we are here for happiness, I think it is time to put our thinking caps on because we have a lot to do this morning. I am very honored to be taking you through the plenary session this morning. We have, as introduced, 5 exciting speeches from 5 distinguished speakers. And I am sure that we all share the wish that upon these speeches, we'll get some sort of pearls of wisdom that will allow us to navigate through the choppy waters of the current geopolitical movement in Northeast Asia and achieve the happiness that Chairman Jie just mentioned. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker today, who is the first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hyun. His last post overseas was in India a couple of years ago, and he returned to Korea in 2017 and has successfully become the second and now the first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. So may I invite Vice Minister Cho onto the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Foreign Ministry, I would like to congratulate all of you on this meaningful launch of the Institute. And also, let me welcome the prominent scholars from China and the United States. I recognize many faces here. Welcome to Korea. Jie-ae Institute for Advanced Studies registered under the Foreign Ministry sometime last year, and well, as a non-profit organization, and I understand this is the launching conference. As we have seen the video of the background of this institute, I think it will be a good platform for realizing the vision of late Chairman Choi-Jong-hyun. So congratulations to Chairman Jie as well. Ladies and gentlemen, today you will discuss and hear on Northeast Asia in transition. I think this is very timely and important issue for 2 reasons. First, it was mentioned by the way, by Chairman Jie, but I will talk about the other way around. First, because of security reasons. The security landscape in Northeast Asia has been changing very rapidly. And we are at a critical juncture as we will soon witness the second summit in Hanoi at the end of this month. And as for our 3 countries, the United States, China, and Republic of Korea, we are all key players. As for the United States, you are playing the leading role. And as for China, as Chairman Kim Jong-un visited China in preparation for the second summit, you are maybe the most responsible member. And as for ROK, this issue is an existential one. So I must claim that we are indispensable player. Therefore, it's a corollary that scholars from these 3 countries get together and discuss the future of the upcoming summit and afterwards. how we can achieve complete denuclearization and how we can establish permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. The second reason that today's topic was well picked up and very appropriate is because of trade tensions between the United States and China. I don't know whether this is just a trade tension or something deeper than that, as described in the book 100-Year Marathon by Mr. Pillsbury. But I do know that it is an important issue for both China and the United States. It is also equally important for the rest of the world, particularly for Korea, which happens to be one of the biggest trading partners with both China and the United States. Given the size of the Korean economy, pundits in Korea used to call ourselves rather pejoratively that we are just a shrimp among the giants. As the Korean economy has grown up, some others have argued that now we are a dolphin with two large whales. I don't think such analogies are perfectly fitting in any case, but maybe I like the idea of dolphin because maybe it is more intelligent than whales. So allow me to offer something for your discussions and for your thoughts. It's just small idea for food for thought. First, on security front. Well, the current negotiations between the United States and North Korea is crucially important. And we also believe that this is an excellent opportunity for achieving complete denuclearization after years, after decades of waiting. I cannot overemphasize the importance of this issue because, as I said earlier, this is an existential issue for ROK. Well, there are some skeptics, maybe some skeptics even in this room. But I heard President Moon Jae-in saying in person that we can achieve the goal of complete denuclearization and permanent peace by working together with two other leaders. At the time, I thought that this is it. This is the vision of a leader. It's up to us, the rest of the government officials, to realize it. So let's hope for the best. In realizing this vision, I think we can think about a role playing among the three countries. We, the three countries, are the leading negotiator, the leading country, and the most responsible country, and ROK is directly involved in this issue, and we are an indispensable country. So we can find and strengthen a trilateral cooperative mechanism. We can also find and play a different and yet well-coordinated role among us. We can also act sometimes individually and sometimes collectively to attain the common goal of complete denuclearization and finally the permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. Furthermore, I believe that when trilateral cooperative mechanism works well, then we can expand the scope of our discussion to other areas such as non-traditional security things, such as cybersecurity, terrorism, and or public health epidemics. So let's continue our talks for the time being among the scholars, prominent scholars like you in this way. Secondly, on the economic front, while we wait for a denouement, great resolution of the trade disputes, I think we Korean scholars can offer some ideas because Korea happens to be the largest trading partner with the two countries. But more importantly, Korea was the founding member of the WTO. Furthermore, we have an experience of dealing with these two giants. Back in 1990s, we was troubled with so many trade measures from the US government. Of course, we were responsible for some, but anyway, I vividly remember Section 301, Special 301, and tariff quotas, and so on. So Korean businessmen also has acquired some good knowledge about the Chinese market and also the Chinese industry. But most recently, we were able to experience some Chinese trade measures as well at the time of this THAAD crisis, which is yet to be finally resolved. Well, if we benefit from this trilateral setting for getting more ideas on trade talks, I think we can expand the scope of discussion as well. How to enhance trade and investment among the three countries and beyond. How to sort out trade disputes as we did earlier. And how to enhance predictability in markets, the market of the three countries. Furthermore, when we do such discussions well, we can expand our scope of discussion to such new areas like intellectual property rights, but more importantly, antitrust law. We know that the US has been applying extraterritorial application of this antitrust law. So we should understand more about it for enhanced trade and investment. Finally, one small practical suggestion as a government official. When the trilateral dialogue works well among these prominent scholars, I think we can continue to engage with each other, and at some stage we might think about a more constructive engagement on the government level. Perhaps starting with 1.5 track dialogue, which can eventually develop into a regularized US-Korea ROK trilateral meetings in the future. Well, these were just three ideas or some food for thought for your discussion today. I look forward to hearing from you, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Minister Cho, for laying out the geopolitical situation as well as the economic situation in Northeast Asia. I also agree that I like the dolphin better than the shrimp. Now we move on to the United States, and we are honored to have the U.S. Ambassador to Korea, Mr. Harry Harris, here today to address us. He has been appointed to the U.S. Ambassador from June 2018, and almost a year. And he was formerly the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So I would like to invite Ambassador Harris.
Minister Cho, you've set the bar high, and I'll do my best to get over it. Chairman Jie, and congratulations to you and SK on the launch of the Jie Institute and on this inaugural conference on Northeast Asia in transition. I look forward to partnering with you as you build a platform for bringing together the best from across the region and around the world to exchange ideas and strengthen cooperation. Likewise, thanks to the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for supporting this discussion. And to all of you whom traveled here from far away, welcome. And to our Chinese friends, happy Year of the Golden Pig. I hope this year is a prosperous one for all of us. And a personal shout out to the American delegation here, many of whom are not only friends and colleagues, but ambassadors, doctors, mentors, and teachers too. It's great to see the great Stapleton Roy here, and Dr. Kurt Campbell, Dr. Ed FEULNER, Kathy Stevens, Dr. Bob Gallucci, Danny Russell, Victor Cha, Joe Hyun, and Bob Einhorn. And I'll note that Kurt Campbell was one of my Songsanim, or professors at Harvard, and Bob Gallucci was the dean of the School of Foreign Service when I studied there. So here's a pearl of wisdom. If you don't like what I say or do, you can blame them. Now to business. Folks, I have the Matador's Challenge ahead of me. I have to make a point here and a point over here and hope that there's not a lot of bull in between. So it's my pleasure and honor to speak with all of you at such an important event. My work in Korea is the cherry on top of a career focused on Asia. There is no place more dynamic to serve as the U.S. ambassador, and no better partner or ally for the United States than the Republic of Korea. Don't believe everything you read in the papers. I'm as committed to the alliance today as I ever was. Our relationship is broad and deep as we cooperate on a range of vitally important issues: security, economic, cultural, and scientific, among many others. More importantly, though, ours is a relationship grounded in deeply shared values and interests. Now, I've been privileged to work on Indo-Pacific issues for many years. Across this region, we see incredible progress and opportunity. However, as this crowd knows all too well, we also face serious challenges that will shape the world that we will pass on to future generations. So over the next 2 days, you'll have an opportunity to discuss that progress and those challenges. Looking at the topics ahead of you, I wish I could be with you for the entire time. What I will do in my limited time this morning is prime the pump a bit. I'd like to highlight the extraordinary historic events that have positioned Korea, the United States, and the entire Indo-Pacific to achieve even greater outcomes in the future. I'll also recap key components of the U.S. vision for this region. Now, over the past year, we've witnessed a whirlwind of diplomacy in Northeast Asia. Developments that, for many, myself included in my previous job, were unimaginable just a short time ago. First, the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, then 3 summits between ROK President Moon Jae-in and DPRK Chairman Kim Jong-Un, 4 summits between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Chairman Kim, and the first ever summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim in Singapore. Folks, that is a lot of diplomacy. Now, on January 18th, President Trump and DPRK Vice Chairman Kim Yong-chol met at the White House. Special Representative Steve Biegun continued that dialogue in Pyongyang last week with his counterpart, Ambassador Kim Hyok-chol. He discussed advancing commitments that President Trump and Chairman Kim made in Singapore regarding the complete denuclearization of North Korea, transforming the U.S.-DPRK relationship, and building a lasting peace on the peninsula. As a result, we're now poised for a second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim at the end of this month in Hanoi. Exciting times for sure. Now, President Moon has made tremendous efforts to reach out to the North Koreans to help lay the groundwork for lasting peace on the peninsula. For the first time, the two Koreas, with the help and support of the United States, have a comprehensive military agreement for reducing tensions on the border. including reestablishing military hotlines. Guard posts and minefields are being dismantled in the joint security area. The two Koreas have also opened a joint liaison office in Kaesong. Against this backdrop, the U.S. and ROK governments are coordinating closely on all inter-Korea developments. Our goal remains the same, to achieve our shared objective of the final fully verified denuclearization of the DPRK as committed to by Chairman Kim in Singapore. The United States and our South Korean ally are in complete agreement that sanctions will remain until the DPRK denuclearizes. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that without China's support on sanctions, we wouldn't have achieved the progress that we've made so far. Should North Korea fulfill its commitment to denuclearize, we will work with the ROK and our allies and partners in the region, including China and Japan, to offer a brighter, more secure, more prosperous future for North Korea. Now, the developments on the peninsula are an important part of the U.S. commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. This is not just the United States' interest, but in all of our nation's strategic interests. As Secretary Pompeo said last year, when we say free, we want all nations to be able to protect their sovereignty from coercion by other countries. When we say open, we want all nations to enjoy open access to the seas and airways, and we want the peaceful resolution of territorial and maritime disputes, a key for international peace. Economically, open means fair and reciprocal trade, open investment environments, transparent agreements between nations, and improved connectivity to drive regional ties, because these are the paths for sustainable growth in the region. So that focus on an open economy will be part of what U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin will be discussing beginning today in Beijing. Trade Rep Lighthizer noted in a meeting at the White House with China's Vice Premier Liu He that there remains a lot of work to be done, but that we have made substantial progress. Here's hoping we can continue to make that progress so that this year of the Golden Pig will live up to its reputation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're blessed to have strategic-minded folks like you who are aware of the challenges and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. You play an important part in shaping our nation's futures, developing new centers of influence right here in Korea and beyond to help ensure that this region continues on its trajectory of security and success. So I wish you all the best for a productive and dynamic conference. Forums such as these are invaluable, first and foremost because they get people sitting down in the same room and talking, with the understanding that each country has its own national interests and visions for the future. I think there are more areas upon which we agree than disagree. We all recognize the importance of trade and economic ties to growth. We all see the opportunities created by a level playing field. Most of all, we agree on the need for dialogue to address common concerns, especially in Northeast Asia in transition. So thank you for all that you do to keep this region safe, secure, and prosperous. Sehe Pokmani, Padiseo. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, don't see a lot to blame and a lot to thank to your 선생님들 or your mentors for your speech today. He has aptly primed us for our next speaker, who is Mr. Edward FEULNER, who is the founder and former president of the Heritage Foundation, which I read in Wikipedia, I believe, that is America's powerhouse of conservative ideas. He was also a former consultant for the domestic policy for President Reagan. So I would like to invite Mr. FEULNER.
Mr. Vice Minister, Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished friends, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today, even though I've got it's a tough act to follow the last several speakers, including President Park and Chairman Chie, who both set a beautiful stage for where we are And President Park, I'm reminded of my late friend, Nobel laureate Gary Becker, who talked about the need for improving human capital. And how do you measure human capital? And that's what so much of what this new institute is going to be focused on. So I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for what you are doing with it. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank you very much for what you have done. I congratulate you on this landmark decision as you have chosen to honor your late father. I believe that this institute will make significant contributions of timely analysis of geopolitical risks and exploring avenues of innovation through interdisciplinary approaches by many of Korea's best minds, and hopefully borrowing extensively not only from your neighbors but also from your friends and allies across the Pacific. My first visit to Korea was 1971. I've been back, I think, by actual count, 123 times since, which means I've racked up a fair number of miles. But this particular trip is a very special one for me because of this inaugural conference, bringing together some old friends, both from Korea and, of course, friends from the United States, from whom I have learned so much, people like Stape Roy and so many others who are here. But with the second Trump-Kim summit scheduled to take place in just 2 weeks, the conference could not be more timely. Several weeks ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with Steve Biegun, who's already been mentioned, and who is President Trump's special envoy for North Korea. Steve and I go back quite a ways to when he was chief of staff for the late Senator Jesse Helms, who was, as many of you know, a longtime member of the Foreign Relations Committee and chairman of that committee. So Steve not only knows his way around corporate America from his position at Ford Motor Company, but also knows his way through foreign policy business. We had a very candid discussion on key matters related to the Korean Peninsula. We discussed the unfolding policy environment we're currently in and how we're going to go through turbulent yet potentially opportune times as we reflect on the theme, Northeast Asia in transition. I'll just take a few steps back briefly. To my mind, one of the critical objectives in addressing the North Korean issue has been to preserve and expand the U.S.-Korea partnership that Ambassador Harris spoke of so eloquently. And as we work together on establishing a lasting solution to the challenge of the whole peninsula, time and again over the past quarter century in the United States, under Democratic and Republican presidents, we have made it clear that we would not accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. It's not just the United States position, it's a position of the world. So we have great hope as we look forward to the meeting in Hanoi. And to that end, since taking office, President Trump has led the international sanctions campaign and reminded North Korea that much is at stake, but that a brighter future is also possible. We know that some want to see this new reality come as quickly as possible. We would all like to see that happen. However, I believe that the path to peace and a brighter future is only through total denuclearization on the peninsula. That means any other path that North Korea may choose will invariably lead to still more international pressure, not only disappointment from others, including Washington, but I presume also including Beijing, and that in this path, I believe the Trump administration, were it to go astray, would push for increased pressure on the DPRK. Let's be optimistic as we look ahead and work within the Trump administration's, if you will, top-down diplomacy, that if Kim Jong-Un follows through on his commitments, a much brighter future lies ahead for North Korea and its people. I believe that the Trump administration has set a clear standard and has exposed itself to potential criticism if it delivers anything less. America's number one policy objective has to be the elimination of nuclear threat, that is, denuclearization. not necessarily the transformation of North Korea. And that's for further discussion, I'm sure, during the course of the next several days. And again, I commend Minister Cho for his comments along that line. Let us add that when Steve and I had our discussion, he also said, for the record, and I quote, "We need to have contingencies if the diplomatic process fails," which we do. Indeed, the upcoming Trump-Kim summit in Hanoi is a critical bridge to that possible new chapter on the Korean Peninsula. In the context of these ongoing developments, permit me to share with you my personal observations about President Trump and his foreign policy thinking. Knowing many of the participants from the American side, at least in this program, I think I'm probably about the only one who actually worked for candidate Trump, then President-elect Trump, and still has the opportunity to consult with him as President of the United States. One of the things I learned early on during the campaign and then during the transition process was that Donald Trump believes in an America First foreign policy. He believes that what America does in the foreign policy arena is based on protecting and advancing the interests of the American people. But that America First foreign policy, I remind you, and as the President has reminded all of us on several occasions, does not mean an America only foreign policy. And I know, again, from personal discussions, that he considers this bilateral relationship to be an extremely important, indeed critical one for the future. Let me make another point about this president. I know this again from personal interaction. He is a president who listens, thinks, considers, and yes, then makes up his own mind. He pays attention to alternative views, but when he makes a decision, he expects his whole team to get on board and to implement that decision. Trump, the businessman, then the candidate, and now the President of the United States, has written that if you are facing a challenge, think big and go into negotiations or even discussions as a disruptor. That is, come up with new ideas that are so far outside the conventional boundaries of what is considered possible that you're effectively changing not only the debate, but the whole framework, the whole range of options within that debate. 2 summits within a year, I'd say that was pretty disruptive and pretty unconventional. What Donald Trump, the disruptor, does is to expand the debate so the decision goes beyond the conventional boundaries of discussion. It's a new approach for many of us geeks from the think tank or my distinguished colleagues who have served in government. This means, yes, President Trump is a tough negotiator. As he has said, and I quote, "Without friction, there can be no lift." I just mentioned briefly, since it's been discussed and since it's obviously an integral part of this program, the U.S.-Chinese relationship at this time. We're all pleased that the inaugural Jie-ae Institute welcomes a number of experts and scholars from China, several of whom are longtime friends, and I look forward to being with them and also to exchanging views with our Chinese colleagues whom I haven't had the privilege of getting to know in the past. Let me begin also by saying that those of you who know me over the years know that I have been a strong and sincere advocate for China's accession to the World Trade Organization some 20 years ago. In fact, at that time, I assembled a group of think tank heads across the political spectrum in Washington, and we held a joint conference saying that no matter what our political differences were, we all concurred that China should become a member of WTO. We did that on the assumption that WTO would bring China into world standards, if you will, in terms of international trade relationships. Since that time, American trade with China in both directions, American foreign direct investment in China, has grown at an incredibly rapid rate. And yet, we all applauded, and yes, we also all applauded China's market reforms that have lifted literally hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty. Many of us believe, however, that China can and should be doing more in terms of abiding by the rules in the global trading system. This view is not exclusively American. We've read recent reports from various European allies that they too are concerned about it. Well, it would be politically convenient to attribute this current friction over these issues to the Trump administration. But really, for those who followed it over the years, the problems highlighted by President Trump have been on the table in our relationship for years. Subsidies, market access questions, SOE, unfair competition, IPR theft, forced technology transfers, and well, the list goes on. Let me be clear, the Trump administration is serious about addressing these long-standing issues and establishing a new forward-looking course of America's economic engagement with China. Like Ambassador Harris and most others here, I'm sure, I applaud the fact that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer are currently at this very moment meeting with their counterparts in Beijing and hopefully working out some of these questions. Obviously, this is a concern at the highest levels of our government. Vice President Pence elaborated details about the Trump administration's China policy at our sister organization, the Hudson Institute, on October 4th. I urge you to read that speech. Let me make a personal observation here, too. I've known Mike Pence since he ran a small conservative state think tank in Fort Wayne, Indiana, before he was a member of Congress, before he was in the congressional leadership, before he was governor, and certainly before he was vice president. And one thing I can absolutely assure everyone of, Mike Pence is not a freelancer. If Mike Pence gets up and gives an elaborate discussion of what U.S. policy toward China should be, pay attention, because that's the administration's word. His speech represents the administration's position, and it's a strong statement of both U.S. long-term goals and specific short-term objectives in that bilateral relationship. My last trip to Beijing several months ago, I was honored to be able to meet with Vice President Wang Qishan. Our extended discussion didn't result in any specific conclusions, but it was fruitful and raised some possible areas of convergence in the future. Like this conference, I believe it's very important to continue to seek every opportunity to pursue dialogue and interaction with Beijing so that we can eliminate sources of misunderstanding, reduce the risks of miscalculation, and offer China the opportunity to uphold and strengthen the international order, and that new understanding need not be based on Thucydides or Charlie Kindleberger. As one of Washington's congenital optimists, I believe progress can be made with regard to the current status of U.S.-China relations, and I hope we will see results of that in the weeks and months ahead. But I caution all of us who deal with these issues on a bilateral or a multilateral basis to not underestimate the commitment of this administration, nor of congressional members in both political parties, to demand specific, significant changes to the status quo in the bilateral economic relationship between the United States and the PRC. Let me close with the following. In my 40-some years as president of the Heritage Foundation, I always argued, and I still very much believe, that ideas have consequences. And I believe that through the interplay between innovative thinking and follow-up action, we can keep adding and multiplying a more positive future based on our shared ideas and our shared goals. I have no doubt that the Jie-ae Institute for Advanced Studies will chart such a course of action in the future. Again, I thank you for giving me this opportunity, Mr. Chairman. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your invaluable insights into the current U.S. administration and President Trump himself. The next speaker today that we have is Mr. Kurt Campbell. He is the chairman and chief executive officer of the Asia Group, which is a strategic advisory and capital management group. But he was also the former assistant secretary of state for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during President Obama's administration. So I would like to invite Mr. Campbell.
President Park, Chairman Jie-ae, many friends here from Korea, from the United States, and from China. It's an honor to be here with you. I'm so thrilled to be back in Seoul, and it's such a consequential period. Chairman, I want to congratulate you on launching the Jie Institute. This is a tremendous initiative. We often say, and I can't remember a time when I've been involved in foreign policy over 30 or 40 years. Every time we meet, we say this is a deeply consequential time. And many times it's really not, but I want to make the argument that really the period that we're living in right now is deeply consequential. And I'm afraid I'm not as optimistic as Ed is, and I want to give you a different kind of picture about what to expect and what to think about in terms of particularly the American role in Asia and what I think are some of the larger strategic issues that are confronting the United States. And I want to start with three numbers to think about: 70, 40, and 20, okay? And this year, in many respects, marks anniversaries in some respect of very important, formative, decisive ways in which the United States has engaged in the world. And I'll take you through each. Essentially, this is about the 20-year anniversary of our first engagements in the Middle East. As we meet here, a number of the architects of the U.S.-China engagement that took place 40 years ago are also meeting in Beijing and Washington to celebrate the enormous achievement of the establishment of bilateral relations. And this is also about the 70th anniversary of what we might call the Washington Consensus, which really decisively defined the American role in the world. And I would say all three of those are showing some profound signs of stress and suggest arenas of uncertainty as we go forward. The first, obviously, I think the American people have grown deeply frustrated and concerned about a open-ended strategic engagement in the Middle East. It has consumed an enormous amount of our time and our energy and our focus. And in fact, I've argued, and others have as well, that it has taken our attention away from really the most consequential issues on the planet that are really playing out here in Asia. And I think most Americans are deeply dissatisfied and concerned about these last 20 years and are uncertain about whether our investments have actually yielded the kind of returns we'd like to see. And I think over time you will see, and I really commend the president for arguing about why it's important to focus on other parts of the planet. I was struck in government about how much time, how consuming these incredibly difficult issues have been in the Middle East. And if we are to focus more consequentially on Asia, we must take steps to rebalance our investment strategically. The second, the 40-year engagement with China. As we celebrate, and it's an important, incredibly strategic relationship going forward, one of the only areas of true bipartisan agreement in Washington currently is a sense that there are elements of the U.S.-China relationship that are no longer working for the United States, and that it's important for Americans to think carefully and strategically about how that relationship has to be amended in technology, strategically, politically, for it to be effective into the next phase. This has to be done in a way that is not fear-mongering, that doesn't suggest you throw everything out, because there is so much that is important and vital, I agree with Ed, in the U.S.-China relationship. But you need to understand that the fundamentals behind that relationship are in question. The third area is the most consequential one and the most difficult. For 70 years, there's essentially been a consensus between the two wings, between the entirety of the Republican Party and the internationalist wing of the Democratic Party about what we believed in on the global stage. Strong forward commitment to our allies, a clear sense of optimism with respect to trade, support for values, democratization, and a sense of the need to commit American prestige globally, internationally. Now, I will tell you, I think most of those are under deep fundamental question in the United States. What we've seen fundamentally is that consensus has completely collapsed within the Republican Party. It was already under duress in the Democratic Party after Vietnam, and now we are going to go through a process over the next 2 years where deep questions about what does it mean to be an American in the world. And you will see that playing out on trade, you will see it play out on alliances, and you will see it play out on the nature of our engagement on human rights and democracy. This is a fundamentally worrying set of concerns. I will tell you one of the things that's most important for conferences like this is that once we have a meeting like this, Ed can take a message back for his next meeting with the president and say, Mr. President, in many areas, you're on the wrong course. And reaffirming our relationship with our allies is essential. And particularly at the top of that list is that relationship between the United States and South Korea. So those issues are in play in the United States as they have not been for decades. And so it's important to focus, as Ambassador Harris did, on these important developments between the United States and North Korea. The next several months will be critical for President Trump. But I'd like you to keep in mind this larger strategic set of challenges for the United States will be resolved, and I think probably painfully over the next several years as we struggle to define new ways to engage the world. I want to conclude by giving you a sense of where I think issues are going in the Trump administration with respect to China, because in many respects, that's going to be the most important set of issues as they play out. And on this issue, there is no consensus. There are a group of powerful individuals and groups that are arguing for position on a number of key matters inside the Trump administration. The first group, and again, I commend the discussion around what Secretary Mnuchin has been doing in China. Secretary Mnuchin is a traditionalist, and he believes fundamentally that if China can buy more things from the United States, at least in the short term, that we can settle the relationship between the United States and China. So he has argued primarily for a massive buying mission on the part of China. Soybeans, Boeing jets, GE engines, you name it, but approaching $1 trillion over several years to try to effectively change the nature of the balance of trade. And that would be very attractive, obviously, to the president. There's a second group, however, that says that's not going to be enough. It won't work, and it's not. It's important, but it's not all that needs to be done. The second group would be structuralists, and they would say, fundamentally, what needs to happen is China has to completely redesign many of its initiatives that have made it difficult for American firms, American business, to be successful in China. The China 2025. The number of Chinese business initiatives made in China, all of which have made it difficult for American firms to be effective. This group, led by, I think, probably U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer, understands the challenges here, though. To make those changes in the Chinese system would require very intensive deliberations and negotiations. This is not yet, they have not demonstrated an ability or an interest really in negotiating. There's a lot of, here's what we'd like from you, China, do it. That's not how China interacts. And over time, to make these kinds of changes would be an enormous diplomatic achievement that would take probably years. And I'm also not clear that there's going to be the interest fundamentally on the part of the president to do things that are really about making American business operate more effective internationally. He's much more interested in American business at home and then promoting exports accordingly. There is then a third group that argues fundamentally what needs to take place between the United States and China is a degree of decoupling. and that fundamentally there are elements of Chinese investment in the United States, there are areas in IT and in infrastructure that are not in American strategic interests, and that the United States and China must separate some. I think there are many that understand to do such a thing is a little bit like separating Siamese twins in surgery, and the challenges to both can be dramatic. And I think in many respects we've underestimated the risks or challenges associated with that separation. But that is a powerful group in the White House that are arguing increasingly that there are elements about the Chinese approach to the internet and to other technologies that require the United States to go in a different direction. Then there's probably a fourth group that occasionally aligns with the first. And this group, led by probably Secretary Pompeo, that argues fundamentally, look, I want to make progress on North Korea, and to make progress on North Korea, I need a good relationship with China. So fundamentally arguing this is the traditional diplomatic approach. We need China on the diplomatic arena, not so much for international multilateral agenda. There's no interest in working on climate change. There's very little interest in other areas. But on these narrow bilateral issues that are very important to the administration, China's essential. And then there's the last group, which is really in the Pentagon. And they are essentially thinking carefully about the kinds of investments and innovation that will be necessary to really grapple with a different set of challenges strategically and militarily. Over the last 20 years, you've seen remarkable investments in special forces, in ground forces, and a number of activities involved with a hot war in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. The next phase is about how to adapt and adopt technologies and capabilities, largely by the Air Force and the Navy, to be an effective long-term stabilizing power in the Asia-Pacific region. And that process is really just beginning in the Pentagon, and it's fundamental. What's clear here, though, is that there is yet to be an overarching refrain or position about how we want to go forward. And in this administration, it will require the president's strategic insight about this is the direction that we need to go, or the next administration. All I would say in conclusion, the reason that I'm grateful for the chairman setting up this initiative, in the past, we had often seen Americans coming abroad to explain our position and why we wanted certain changes and why we wanted you to do certain things so that you could be more effective partners in the United States, for the United States. Increasingly, the role of partners and friends in Japan, South Korea, Australia, across Asia, is to remind Americans of the importance of our role and how critical a strong, stable, predictable America is for stability in the Asia-Pacific region. So what I urge all of you to do, I love coming to Korea. Friends are so polite. Please, with each of us, pull us aside and explain to us how important the role of the United States has been and will be into the future. And I want to just say, Chairman, that I think all of us stand with you with a strong commitment to do whatever we can to keep the alliance between the United States and South Korea as strong in the future as it has been in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. He has really given us a lot to think about in terms of strategic thinking, and I am looking forward to a lot of Americans being pulled over during lunch and the afternoon sessions. Each speaker has really raised the bar in terms of what we have to think about and what our challenges are. And it's very difficult to follow all these wonderful speakers. But if anyone is up to the challenge, it will be our final and last speaker for this plenary session. I am happy to introduce Professor Jie Chinku, professor of the School of International Studies from Peking University. He's also the director of the Institute for China-U.S. People-to-People Exchange of the Ministry of Education. So I'd like to invite Professor Jie to the floor.
Before me, I want to take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Park for the invitation, and also President Cui Chairman Cui for inviting me. And also congratulations on the founding of the Jie-ae Institute of Advanced International Studies. What I want to talk today is the topic, constructive competition or destructive confrontation, China-US relations at a major crossroad. China-US relationship is at a major historical crossroad. I agree with Kurt that this is a critical moment, not only for the world, but also for China-US relations. It can embark on a path of constructive competition. It can also slide into a process of destructive confrontation. Given the size of the two economies and the vast resources each commands, how this relationship evolves will have a tremendous impact on the future of the two countries and also the future of the world. While it is in the respective interests of the two countries to embark on the path of constructive engagement or competition, the risk of ending up in a process of destructive confrontation is actually quite high. It is high time for leaders of both countries to pay attention to the challenges and also exercise leadership as well as wisdom to avoid destructive confrontation and promote constructive competition or engagement. What do I mean by a major historical crossroad? Since the end of 2017, China-US relationship has gone from bad to worse. The trade war has captured the headlines. The volume of trade and investment involved is unprecedented. The demands for legal and policy changes from the US are presented in a way that look like nothing short of an ultimatum. It is quite a miracle that the talks are still going on and people are still counting on a grand deal between the two sides before the 19-day deadline. Despite its prominence, the trade war is only the tip of an iceberg of tension between the two countries. To begin with, ideological differences between the two countries, which had been shelved for a long time, is re-emerging as a significant factor to define the relationship. Whereas China stepped up efforts to fend off the infiltration of Western ideas from the outside, the US began to complain about China's alleged attempts to influence American domestic politics. For instance, Vice President Pence, in his speech at the Hudson Institute last October, accused China for interfering in American domestic politics. There is also a lot of talk about the different models or consensus between the two countries, as if they are competing. Moreover, one sees more military frictions between the two countries than before. As China tries to assert its sovereignty over islands and features in the South China Sea, the US dispatches warships to demonstrate its opposition to China's alleged efforts to deny freedom of navigation in the high seas, despite China's repeated statements that it stands for freedom of navigation rather than otherwise. In 2017, the National Security Council of the US called US national security strategy called China a strategic competitor a security threat to the US. Finally, one hears some American strategies calling for economic decoupling with China. I was actually quite shocked when I was visiting the US and heard one liberal think tank person talking about preparing a policy suggestion to the Trump administration that the US should decouple its economy from China. Are we in a Cold War now? This is the question many people ask nowadays. I would say that we are not quite there yet. Actually, we are still quite far away from that yet. In history, there was only one Cold War. That was between the US and the Soviet Union. If that is what we mean by Cold War, the Cold War should satisfy at least three requirements: ideological rivalry, military confrontation, and economic separation. In terms of ideological rivalry, I think we see some emerging signs, but they are quite rudimentary at the moment. China has not yet come up with an ideology to compete with the US. In terms of military confrontation, we are still at the very early stage. Okay. We see some skirmishes in the South China Sea, and that's it. In terms of economic separation, we are still talking about it. Of course, the investment has suffered quite significantly because of the U.S. Efforts in terms of in terms of investment, it has declined quite significantly in each other, especially China's investment in the U.S. because of the technological restrictions on the part of the U.S. Okay. Therefore, we are not quite at a Cold War yet. Okay. Will we end up in a Cold War? I think it depends. If states act rationally, this is unlikely, given the huge stakes we have in our relationship, and also the serious harm that would bring to our interests if we are in a Cold War. Okay. However, states are run by people who can be emotional and whose behavior is often politically driven. When emotions take over, and when it is believed to be politically necessary, people can do things that are short-sighted and sometimes stupid. Okay. Therefore, it is entirely possible that we will end up in a Cold War. And it can happen sooner than we can expect. Accidents such as the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's CFO in Canada, and the near clash between Chinese and American Navy vessels in the South China Sea can bring us into the Cold War sooner than we can expect now. Imagine if China had retaliated by arresting American CEOs on criminal charges in China, or ask a friendly country to arrest American CEO on criminal charges in that country. China can do it legally, just as the US did before, because almost all of the big international corporations have some legal problems. Also imagine the Chinese destroyer did run into the US destroyer, Dakota, in the South China Sea, and some people got killed. In both cases, emotions could run very high, either in the US or in China, or in both. And retaliation will be followed by retaliation. If such things happen, the current dense and mutually beneficial relationship between the two countries would quickly vanish, and the two countries would quickly end up in a Cold War. Therefore, we are at a major historical crossroad. Depending on what we do, we can either end up in a stable relationship of benign or at least manageable competition, or we can let it fall and slip into a confrontation of a Cold War. Okay, we may get ourselves into a Cold War, so what? If we do get into a Cold War, we have a lot to lose and more to risk. To begin with, in a Cold War, the two countries are going to lose a lot of benefits the current arrangement has enabled us to have. Okay. This includes the current level of security, the trade and investment, joint endorsement of the existing international order, and cooperation on various aspects of global governance, including the management of the North Korean nuclear challenge. In addition, in a Cold War, the two countries would have to spend a lot more than now for defense and confrontation. This may mean more nuclear weapons, more missiles. It may also mean the end of a non-proliferation regime, and it may also mean the support of terrorist activities in both on the part of either party in the name of freedom or justice. Finally, in a Cold War, the risk of mutual destruction will also increase. Arms race may not be stopped, and balance of terror may lead to the doom of the world. Therefore, Cold War is a big deal, and it is important for both countries to make sure that it will not happen. What then can we do? First, while we try to address our grievances, we should appreciate the value of stability and cooperation in our relationship. This means that we need to introduce some kind of a limit or du in Chinese, in our efforts to push our interests. Specifically, we should make sure that we will not challenge the core interests or national interests of each other. Second, we should introduce some degree of risk tolerance in dealing with each other or in our relationship. At the moment, actually, in security arena, we already have some risk tolerance. For example, both countries accept the other's possession of nuclear weapons. In the high-tech area or in economic area, we should also have some degree of risk tolerance. While Trump's administration's sensitivity or the American sensitivity about the risk of using Chinese high-tech products, it is understandable. Its efforts to deny and exclude the use of Chinese high-tech products are unlikely to serve the U.S. interests in the long run. This is because while it may harm the Chinese high-tech companies and the Chinese economy, it may also hurt the U.S. high-tech companies and U.S. economy. The U.S. may lose the China market, among other things. Therefore, for the two countries to benefit from trade and investment, they need to develop some level of risk tolerance. Finally, both China and the U.S. are stakeholders of the existing international order. Given the their size, they can only advance their respective interests through maintaining the international order. But maintaining international order is a very costly business. according to Paul Kennedy, who wrote the book Rise and Fall of Great Powers, in history, great powers decline not because they are challenged by or they are defeated by the rising powers, but because they were consumed by the cost of maintaining international order. Therefore, it is in their interest to cut the cost of maintaining international order. And they want to make good use of other countries' resources to help maintaining international order. So it is in terms of China and US, there is no other better way to make good use of the other countries' resources to help maintain the international order. Therefore, they should avoid confrontation and try to engage in cooperation. So given the huge cost of confrontation and great benefits of cooperation, I would like to urge leaders of both countries to take the challenge in the most serious way and undertake measures that would limit confrontation while promoting cooperation. Finally, what is the prospect of cooperation? At the moment, it doesn't look good. However, one should never underestimate the human ability to appreciate the costs and benefits involved and make the right decision in the end. In this, I hope and pray. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we have come to a very exciting aspect of our plenary session. We would like to invite our three speakers, Mr. FEULNER, Mr. Campbell, and Professor Zhao, onto the stage, where we will be able to go a little more in depth and maybe raise some of the issues today. My apologies ahead of time. I know that there was a sign that you could raise questions, but we actually don't have a lot of time, and I trust that these speakers will be around in the morning, so you may address them later on during the day. In our 20-minute session or so, we will sort of let our three speakers discuss amongst ourselves, if that's okay. So my apologies in advance, and we'll get the discussion underway. So thank you very much. It was a fascinating session. But I'm a journalist by heart, by trade, and it is a burning journalist question that needs to be asked, and I thought I'd get it out of the way. Now, the Hanoi summit is in 2 weeks' time. And a lot of us, because we are in Korea, we are focused on what is going to be done and what will be the result. Now, from your point of view, what would you say upon the Hanoi summit? What would you say would make Hanoi summit a success? What would you look for as a result of what is going to be conducted in Hanoi in 2 weeks' time? I'll just go down the line and ask all three of you.
Measurable specifics. Yongbang nuclear facility, other specific tests that say, hey, we are really on the path to denuclearization.
Sorry, just want to follow up. When you say measurable specifics, do you have a target in mind? There could be measurable specifics that don't meet our expectations.
I think, again, looking at the disruptor aspect of where we have come, we have seen some real changes in terms of the U.S.-DPRK relationship since the Trump administration, going from Rocket Man early on to a point now where, for the first time in American history, there's actually been a summit. So what the list of specifics is, I'll leave that to the two principals and to all their advisors to actually figure out. But it has to be real concrete steps in terms of the denuclearization, in terms of eliminating specific facilities that enable them to develop the weapon systems that they have, specifically.
Mr. Campbell?
It's a difficult question, and frankly, we've got people here. One of the great things about coming here and what the chairman has done is assemble some of the great experts on U.S.-North Korean engagement over a period of about 30 years. And, over dinner and lunch, you try to talk with them and get their views. And I think generally speaking, privately, most of us believe it's going to be very tough to get specifics done. It'd be great to get a roadmap that lays out all the specific things that both countries would commit to do. I'm not sure we're going to get there. I think there is a logic to trying to do this from a top-down perspective, but it's not conservative to rush into a meeting that you're not prepared for. And I appreciate, we've got to do the best we can, and we've got to move forward here, but fundamentally we're not prepared. And I think the concern will be at the last minute, there will be concessions taken or positions advanced that are not well vetted in the bureaucracy. And so for me, I think the great achievement over the last couple of years has been the cessation of problematic North Korean behaviors externally. They're still moving ahead internally with their nuclear and their missile work, but they have not been as provocative in the region as they have been in the past. And that is not nothing. That's an important step more generally. And so when you ask the question, for me, my biggest worry is not a lack of progress or a roadmap, but an imprudent step taken at the last minute that's not well vetted. And so one of the things that we had that was enormously helpful was, we had a very strong Secretary of Defense who had a very clear commitment to the military alliance between the United States and South Korea, and careful, vigilant, bipartisan efforts to continue to secure that, even in difficult circumstances. What I would like to avoid is a circumstance that without an appropriate set of consultations or that we would somehow either in certain military exercises or pull U.S. forces off the peninsula. And I will tell you, there's a very real risk of it. I don't think there is strong support for that from anyone other than the president, but I don't think very many people are going to say, you know what, I'm going to resign over this. And that to me is the biggest worry as we go forward.
The reason all of you have individual mics is that you can jump in whenever. So I am not going to limit you to being called upon. But since you're not going to say anything, we are going to move on to Professor Jiang.
Well, I share the view of Kurt that we hope that this summit would achieve a major progress, but the chance for that to happen is it doesn't look very promising at the moment, because in order for North Korea to take serious steps to cut its nuclear weapons or to denuclearize, we need to have a package of incentives to persuade the Kim Jong-un that, if he gives up nuclear weapons, his life would be better. Okay? This includes, security guarantees, political guarantees, and also economic assistance. But in order to do that, you need to have to work with other. You need to have a multilateral approach. You need other countries, other stakeholders to get involved. But so far, we don't see a lot of consultation in this regard. So short of a major package of incentives, it's very difficult to persuade North Korea to give up the weapon that links to the regime's survival. So maybe we're going to see some, maybe a clearer roadmap agreed in terms of denuclearization, and also maybe some technical agreements on some technical changes, but not a major progress at the moment. So we are not that optimistic.
Before you jump in, and I know you're going to,
yes.
but when you say concerns, when you voice concerns about the lack of consultations, are you talking about the lack of consultations with China, the Beijing leadership?
No, I think, for example, an economic assistance package, if North Korea gives up nuclear weapons, who can provide such kind of economic incentives? Actually, if history is of any guide, South Korea, Japan, and China, right? But we are not sitting together talking about such kind of things at the moment, as far as I know. Okay, but we do need to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I think there certainly have been ideas put forth in terms of possible commitments from not only the neighbors you mentioned, but also from the United States going into, in effect, some kind of an escrow account that would then be released in tranches dependent upon positive specific steps taken by North Korea. So again, I guess I come off as the optimist that looking at Ambassador Begin, at Secretary Pompeo and their travels and what they are, who they are talking to, what they're working on, the fact that our South Korean friends have been very specifically to the United States recently, that Harry Harris, I'm sure, has very high-level meetings here with people in the Blue House, and that, again, I guess I'm just cautiously optimistic in anticipating something positive coming out of 2 weeks from now. And again, as I implied before, for the President of the United States to give somebody who was basically considered an outcast in the international order 2 summits in the course of 1 year, he damn well better get something out of this, or he will have problems with his own base back home, too.
But I think the concern is that because of that pressure, that there might be something that comes out of it that is not, as Mr. Campbell pointed out, vetted and really thought out in terms of long-term effect.
I guess I'm not in the loop. I don't really know who's talking to whom about what. Kurt and I know Randy Shriver in the Pentagon. We know Mac Pottinger on the National Security Staff. Unfortunately, we still don't have a successor to you in the State Department due to extraneous matters. But I know the principal players, and I know that they are very much involved in these discussions. And again, I assume there are lots of things going on that we just aren't aware of now, because there were things going on when you were on the inside that I certainly wasn't. Yeah.
So I think you're going to hear this afternoon from experts that really know North Korea well. Bob Gallucci, Victor, many other people, or Danny Russell. This is an institution, a set of players that move incredibly slowly, actually. And I think the president has actually done a wise thing of kind of putting that in motion. But some of these questions for them are just profoundly esoteric. And I mean, existential. And I think it's going to be hard for them to make the kinds of movements that we would like. That's the first point I would make. My real worry, though, guys, is so I hear what Ed says, that if the president comes out of the summit and says, historic achievements, I'm the greatest diplomat of all time, I'm a genius, but nothing really gets done, I think I'm actually in a very different place than he is. I think what's most interesting is that very few people are going to say anything. You're going to get criticism from some of the Democratic Party, but I don't think you're going to hear very many folks in the Republican Party. Discipline and being attuned to the president's message is incredibly important right now. And so the constants in our relationship, many of them have turned to variables. Like, it would be inconceivable for me that any president, particularly a conservative one, would put our force posture or some of these things on the table, right? They are on the table in a way that make me more anxious and more concerned. And for me, I do agree that there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes, but many of our friends in South Korea do not know, in fact, what's being considered. I think Chinese friends don't, and I'm not sure people inside the administration really have vetted them effectively. And so the worry is steps being taken that have not been thoroughly and given the consequences for all of us, really examined. But at the same time, I stand aside and want to see how this plays out. And at very least, I think we're not at risk of a major conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And that is something that we can be grateful about. And I think there is a greater sense of hope and optimism on the peninsula than we've seen in 25 years. And I think for any of us who've worked on North Korea, I often say I've worked on it for 30 years. I have a complete, unblemished record of failure. Everything I've worked on, collapse scenarios, all the thing, almost everything I worked on, everything that I thought or predicted has probably come out wrong. And so anyone who works on these issues has to be profoundly humble about expectations and outcomes.
Totally, yes. Professor Joe.
Sometimes I think this is this is an innovative approach on the part of the President Trump. You set up a meeting. We are going to meet at the end of February. It's better for you to make some progress, right? So that because we are going to meet, you have to bring something to the table. Okay. So this is a way to accelerate the process of negotiation, and hopefully he will get what he wants. But then it also means it can be a deadline. Okay, so if you don't bring anything, then something bad will happen. Okay?
Can I say, look, I'm confident that the president and his team is committed to moving forward in a positive way. And so I think seeking to build on that, and I like it. I have very high regard for Steve Biegun. So I think I'm going to try to hold my fire and kind of say, hey, look, let's give this process. But I would also say what's most important for Americans is to understand fundamentally what the nature of the big game is here for us. For the United States, the big game, we have to try to see what we can accomplish in North Korea. The big game is the nature of our relationship with South Korea, Japan, and China, and an enduring role for the United States in Asia. That's central. And so I don't want to do anything with respect to our North Korean diplomacy or meetings or extravaganzas that is going to in any way violate or put at risk some of these other larger equities that we've built up over a period of 50 years.
I think totally. We are anticipating the summit in 2 weeks' time, but I think Mr. Campbell's not alone in that everything that we have expected so far, none of it has come about. And so I think that track record has yet to be broken. We are hoping it'll be broken soon. Now, another type of talk that's going on is the trade talks between U.S. and China at the moment. Professor Chow, you talked about we are not at the Cold War, but we could be heading it. What kind of significance, if any, do you place on the current trade talks, and where do you think what kind of positions should each countries take to avoid the Cold War scenario?
I think at the moment, it seems to me that the two countries are nearing an agreement. China has expressed its willingness to make significant concessions to accommodate the U.S. interests. Of course, also in line with the need for economic reforms in China. The U.S. has also expressed the desire and also made the some officials have made the statement that we are making progress. So it seems to me that both sides are making a lot of efforts to get a deal done. Why is so? I think China's economy is at stake. The U.S. economy is at stake. The world's economy is at stake. We need to fix the trade war before it, put our interest down the drain. Okay? So we are going to have some kind of agreement. I'm pretty optimistic on that. Not necessarily on the deadline, but recently President Trump had a Twitter saying that the deadline can be flexible, but then it won't drag for too long. But as I argued, the temporary resolution of the trade dispute will not solve all the problems between the two countries. We have a lot of challenges to face. We have to think of ways of managing our differences and trying to get the best out of our more constructive side of the relationship.
If I could just jump in, one of the concerning things, Professor, you and I have had discussions in past conferences on economic relationship. One of my concerns about what you said before was your specific references to the Huawei situation, to the detention of the CFO by Canada, that what would happen if China were to detain a major American individual, et cetera, and what would we do in response? Well, obviously, China did certain things in response to that with Canadian nationals. But my fundamental point is that at a time when this administration is trying very hard, I believe, genuinely, to come to agreement on as many of these issues as possible, the notion that somehow there was not a significant legal case against Huawei in terms of what they had done in violating Iranian sanctions under U.S. statute, that the U.S. government would not have pulled the trigger in terms of the detention in Vancouver. And so, obviously we have to let the judicial system work its way out, but we have some pretty significant problems in terms of intellectual property, in terms of where we're going with 5G, and be happy to talk about that in greater detail at another point, but these are real issues.
I think I too am optimistic that I think we're going to be able to come to some areas of agreement. I think in the end it'll be a package of a large buy, that quote buy. We'll see how it plays out over time. I think the Chinese count in some respects on an American, and it's a bipartisan propensity not to follow up as much. A lot of declarations, but when you look at it in years subsequently, maybe the commitments don't turn out to be as deep or as fundamental. But I think there will be some. I think the stakes are so high, and it's starting to affect our economy is humming, but through a series of unforced errors, we are in a much more precarious position today than we were just 4 or 5 months ago. So I actually think the incentives on both countries, not just China, but the United States, to ease some of the tensions is real. The larger issue, though, ladies and gentlemen, is the fundamental changing attitudes about trade in the United States. Yeah. So I have been, and there are some of us in the audience as Democrats who've been pro-trade for years. It's a very uncomfortable position, and it has been extraordinarily bitter and divisive, and it will increase over time, I'm afraid. That process is now exponentially worse in the Republican Party, with many elements of the Republican Party deeply worried about trade. And so you have now essentially elements in both party, internationalist wings of both party, that are more supportive of trade, but the rank and file in both the Democratic and Republican parties questioning the fundamentals of what trade means. What that normally indicates is that we're in a period of fundamental reform of our system, of how, because you align on big issues, and if you have as many issues in which there is disagreement, it suggests that there will be some party realignment going forward. And the question I have is that who's going to emerge as the supporters of trade the next time around? Because I don't think it's going to be either one of the dominant sort of positions of either political party.
There, I think, especially in the age of technological innovations, this kind of the trade barriers that are going up are especially concerning for all of us in the region. But we don't have a lot of time, but I really do want to talk about the one final point, and we sort of draw it back to the Korean Peninsula. We talked about the U.S.-China rivalry and in terms of trade and all of that. How do you think that is affecting what is going on in the Korean Peninsula?
So I would say that in many respects, you know, what's important in the U.S.-China relationship is to define and find those areas where you can act on common interests. What are the areas where a degree of common purpose allows you to work cooperatively together? And the truth is, as two great powers, it is remarkable how few habits of cooperation that we have. We have actually not worked together effectively, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We can get into that. But finding areas where the United States and China can work together fundamentally is a huge project for the next 20 years. Now, I would have said climate change is important. I think others would disagree with that. But it's clear that the issue in which a degree of consensus, deep collaboration, and discussion is essential is on the Korean Peninsula. You know, Bob Gallucci's here, he'll talk later, Victor and others. They were involved in a process, a six-party process, in which China, the United States, Japan, South Korea, others were able to coordinate on the central issue of Northeast Asia, which is the dispensation of political power and understanding about how the Korean Peninsula is going to proceed ahead. And so I actually think that it's one of the few areas that holds a promise of the United States and China working together. However, it will also be the issue on which it will be the most demonstrable example of failure and could lead to open hostility if we do not get our act together. But I'm relatively confident that both states understand the stakes and are prepared to do what's necessary to engage accordingly.
Joe?
Well, at the moment, I think the tension between the China and the U.S. is weakening our cooperation on the North Korean Peninsula issue. You know, China used to be very supportive, especially 2 years ago. You know, but now if you ask China to be more supportive, it becomes more difficult because the state of the relationship is not as good. Okay, but China wants to work with the U.S. on this issue because China wants to stabilize our relationship. So now we are in a very delicate situation. Okay, if the relationship deteriorates further between China and the U.S., then it's difficult to say. Okay, because if China and the U.S. become enemies, like in the Cold War, then what's the point of cooperation from the Chinese perspective? So I would argue that, you know, cooperation is to a significant extent depends on the nature of our relationship. If we are partners, if we are at least friends, or some kind of a stakeholders of the existing international order, then, you know, there is a basis for us to cooperate. But if we become enemies, that's a different situation.
Yep. Great. Okay. Well, we are a little past our time, and I think you're all due a coffee break. I'm sorry to have to end this panel so early. Actually, I would have liked to have 30 minutes with each of you, not as a group. But I think we have been able to this morning set the stage for the rest of the conference, which you have almost a day and a half left, to explore more deeply all the important issues that were raised this morning. So I thank all our panelists, all our speakers, and all of you for listening and paying attention. And hopefully this will lead to a happy conclusion in the end. So thank you very much. And I think the coffee break is happening. Yes, thank you.